On January 15th, the Catholic Church remembers Saint Paul of Thebes, also known as Saint Paul the Hermit, whose life of solitude and penance gave inspiration to the monastic movement during its early years. Surviving in the Egyptian desert on a small amount of daily food, Saint Paul the Hermit lived in close communion with God. Before the end of his life at age 113, he met with Saint Anthony the Great, who led an early community of monks elsewhere in the Egyptian desert. Saint Paul of Thebes was born in Egypt around 227 in the Thebaid of Egypt. Left orphaned at a young age, he suffered much because of a greedy relative over his inheritance. From a very young age, Paul was gifted in learning and filled with a deep love of God. During the persecution against Christians under Emperor Decius, Paul learned of his brother-in-law's insidious plan to deliver him into the hands of the persecutors. And so he fled the city and fled into the wilderness. Settling into a mountain cave, Saint Paul dwelt there for 91 years, praying incessantly to God, both day and night. He would survive this time in the desert, living in a cave where a stream of water flowed. He would eat dates from the palm tree that grew outside and use its leaves to weave a coarse garment. God would also begin to send him a raven with half a loaf of bread each day, recalling the time in the desert of Elijah the prophet. Although he was forced into the wilderness, Paul found that he loved the simplicity and prayer of his new life. He never returned to the outside world, even after the persecution ended. His hermitic way of life inspired people who were seeking a deeper relationship with God through isolation and spiritual discipline. Before his death, after nearly 90 years in the desert, Paul would receive his first visitor. Saint Anthony the Great also lived as an ascetic in the Thebaid desert. He was tempted to think he was the first and the greatest of the hermits. However, one day he had a revelation from God concerning Saint Paul. Then God said to him, "Anthony, there is a servant of God more excellent than you, and you should go and see him." So Anthony, who was already advanced in years, set out to find Saint Paul. In the meantime, Paul had also received a dream about Anthony. The account of Anthony's travel given to us includes some fantastic events that happened to him during this search that in one way or another symbolize the trials, both physical and spiritual, of the desert. Once he found Saint Paul, Anthony fell on the ground before the entrance to the cave, and he asked to be admitted. They greeted each other by name, though they had never met. They embraced and prayed. A raven flew in with a whole loaf of bread. When this occurred, Paul said, "God has sent us our dinner." Each day For the previous 60 years, the raven had brought him but half a loaf. Paul knew that he was close to death, so he asked Anthony to return to his own hermitage and bring back a cloak that Anthony had received from the bishop Saint Athanasius. Anthony was amazed by Paul's knowledge because he had not mentioned the cloak, and Athanasius had not been born when Paul left the outer world. Anthony hurried off to fetch it, but Paul was only trying to soften his guest's sorrow. He did not really need a garment, but wished to depart from his body while Anthony was absent. As Anthony was returning back after a few days, he had a vision of a host of angels, with companies of prophets and apostles, and amid these was Saint Paul climbing the steps of heaven. He knew this meant Saint Paul's death, and weeping, he hastened to reach the cave. There, he found Saint Paul's lifeless body kneeling in prayer, his arms outstretched, and his face lifted to heaven. He wrapped the body in the robe Saint Paul had requested and carried it outside, chanting the hymns and psalms of Christian tradition. He had no means of digging a grave and was really too weak for health. That's when 2 lions came running across the desert towards him. They knelt by the body of Saint Paul and roared lamentations. They started digging a grave with their paws. They then came to Saint Anthony for his blessing. Anthony prayed, "Lord, without whom no leaf lights from the tree, nor a single sparrow falls upon the ground, give unto these even as thou knowest." Anthony buried the holy elder and took his garment. Then he returned to his own monastery. Saint Anthony kept this garb as a precious inheritance and wore it only twice a year, on Pascha and Pentecost. Saint Paul of Thebes died in the year 341, when he was 113 years old. He did not establish a single monastery, but soon after his end, there were many imitators of his life, and they filled the desert with monasteries. Saint Paul is honored as the first desert dweller and hermit.